This isn't an argument. It's a slow look at how something simple became complicated. Let's begin slowly. Tonight I want to talk about how Zen arrived in the West. Not what Zen is, not what it should be, just how it arrived, and why that matters far more than most people realize. Because when something crosses a culture, it doesn't travel intact. It changes shape during the crossing. It compresses. It sheds parts. It picks up new interpretations along the way. And if we don't understand the conditions of that arrival, the actual historical and cultural weather it traveled through, then we mistake the inherited form for the original function. That's a costly mistake, and it's a quiet one. It happens without anyone intending it. Most Western Zen students are genuinely underread on this history. That's not a criticism. It's simply what happens when Zen is introduced through a meditation class, a weekend retreat, a local center. You're given a cushion, a posture, a schedule. You're rarely walked through the political, cultural, and historical conditions that shaped what you're actually practicing. So let's look at that, slowly. Zen did not arrive in the West as a fully transplanted ecosystem. It arrived in fragments. It came through translators, through charismatic individual teachers, through post-war migration, through academic interpreters, and through a counterculture that was deeply, urgently dissatisfied with both Christianity and modern materialism. Think about that for a moment. The West wasn't empty when Zen arrived. It was full of hunger, full of disillusionment, full of people looking for something that felt direct and unmediated and real. Traditional religious institutions had lost enormous credibility. Authority had failed at a structural level. The West was wealthy, increasingly comfortable, and spiritually adrift. And Zen appeared at exactly that moment. But what arrived was not Zen as it functioned inside a medieval Chinese monastery. It was not Zen as it operated inside Japanese temple systems, with centuries of institutional development behind it. What arrived was Zen filtered through translation, condensed into books, presented through lectures to people sitting in rooms in California and New York, interpreted through Western philosophical categories. That distinction is important. It's actually crucial. In Japan, Zen existed inside a dense living framework. It was tied to temple economics, to funerary services, to monastic training hierarchies that spanned decades, to lineage structures with genuine social and institutional weight. It was embedded in a religious culture, the way a root system is embedded in soil. You couldn't just pull the visible plant and carry it across an ocean and expect the same thing to grow. When Zen crossed into the West, most of that underground infrastructure simply did not survive the crossing. What remained visible, what was translatable, demonstrable, packageable, were the surface elements: sitting meditation, robes, ritual forms, enigmatic sayings, stories of dramatic awakening. These things crossed. These things arrived, and Western audiences saw them and understood them, more or less through Western eyes. Calmed the surrounding ecosystem that gave those elements their meaning and their pressure. They didn't survive intact. This is where the first distortion begins, and it's not a dramatic distortion. It's quiet. It's structural. When a practice is removed from its original environment, it tends to become aesthetic before it becomes functional. It becomes something that can be admired and imitated before it is actually understood. Calm Western audiences encountered Zen primarily through literature and through charismatic individual teachers. Suzuki framed Zen in philosophical language that resonated with Western existentialism. Later teachers adapted it to audiences already shaped by psychology and individualism. Calm, the Beat generation embraced Zen as a symbol of spontaneity and rebellion against conformity. The 1960s counterculture embraced it as a living alternative to institutional religion. Zen was interpreted through Western needs, and that interpretation changed its shape. Instead of arriving as a rigorous monastic discipline embedded in centuries of training culture, Zen arrived in the West primarily as a symbol of authenticity, of simplicity, of quiet depth, of nonconformity, of the unspoken and the unmediated. Those qualities aren't false. They're not invented, but they're incomplete. And when you build a practice on an incomplete image, what you build is something different from what you were looking at. There's another compression that happened during transmission that's worth sitting with. Centuries of Buddhist philosophical debate, genuine internal argument, reform movements, doctrinal conflict, the rich and contentious history of Chan in China, the evolution of Zen in Japan through entirely different social and political conditions, all of that was flattened, simplified, collapsed into a single visible practice, sitting meditation. For most Westerners, Zen became synonymous with Zazen. Sit down, be quiet, watch your breath. That reduction is historically massive. Chinese Chan masters actually held a rather dim view of sitting meditation as the central practice. The textual records show tremendous debate about what practice was for and how it worked. In Japan, Zen evolved differently again under figures like Dogen, and differently still through later reform movements. Even within Japan, Zen was not simply sit and awaken. It was embedded in study, in hierarchy, in discipline, in the entire structure of temple life. Most Western students were never told any of this. They weren't told that Zen has multiple historical phases with genuine internal tensions. They weren't told that it moved through periods of political patronage, of state support, of institutional corruption, of reform movements that reacted against those corruptions. They weren't told that the history is contested. That scholars like John McRae have pointed out that lineage narratives in Zen, meaning they are internally coherent fictions built with institutional purpose. Without that knowledge, it's easy to assume the current Western form is timeless, that what you're doing on the cushion is a direct, unbroken continuation of something ancient and unaltered. History doesn't support that assumption. There's one more structural shift worth examining here. Zen arrived through individuals who were navigating a kind of cultural dislocation. Japanese teachers operating in America were functioning outside the traditional oversight structures that existed at home. Western students had very little cultural literacy to evaluate lineage claims or institutional histories. They didn't know what questions to ask. Authority in this new environment became charismatic rather than institutional. It became personal rather than structural. In Japan, a Zen priest operated within a larger temple system with defined roles, defined expectations, real constraints from outside. In the West, Zen often developed as independent centers, built around a single teacher, a single personality, a single interpretation. Without strong institutional scaffolding, legitimacy became narrative, and most students were not equipped or encouraged to examine those narratives historically. Over time, Zen in the West began adapting further. Emotional processing language entered retreats. Trauma awareness entered practice discussions. Community sharing became central to the experience of practice. These adaptations are not inherently wrong. They represent a genuine meeting between a tradition and a culture. But they represent a shift in function. Classical Zen was oriented toward liberation from delusion in a metaphysical sense, toward the uncovering of what one teacher called your true nature, which is unborn and unconditioned, prior to your habits and your history. Modern Western Zen often emphasizes emotional integration, stress reduction, coping mechanisms, and treating them as identical creates a particular kind of confusion that accumulates silently over years of practice. Distortion does not require corruption. That's worth saying clearly. It only requires incomplete transmission and the pressure of a new cultural environment. Zen entered a culture that valued personal meaning, psychological healing, and individual expression. It adapted to survive in that environment. It softened. It translated itself into categories Westerners could accept, and as it softened, certain edges diminished. Originally, Zen functioned as what you might call a pressure system. It exposed contradiction. It destabilized the practitioner's sense of self. It confronted self-deception directly in the West, without the institutional friction of the original environment. Zen became something that could be practiced for decades without producing that kind of structural challenge. That's not a moral failure. It's a structural observation. When nothing pushes back, practice can continue for 20 years without forcing genuine examination of foundational assumptions. Calm thwarm can thrive while the function quietly recedes. So when we ask, what happened to Zen in the West, the first answer is simply this. Zen arrived already altered by transmission, already compressed, already romanticized, already interpreted through cultural hunger rather than historical accuracy. Most students inherited a form without understanding how it was formed. And when you inherit a form without understanding its formation, you can't see where it might be fragile. Zen did not fail in the West, it adapted. And adaptation always changes the shape of what survives. The quiet question isn't whether that's right or wrong. The question is this: what exactly did we inherit? And what did we quietly leave behind?